You are listening to the On Purpose Podcast. Welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of the On Purpose Podcast, where our mission is to brighten the days of people around the world by sharing inspiring, thought-provoking, and purposeful content. This week, I'm proud to bring on somebody that I met this past year in a podcast mastermind group and who's helped me grow this podcast immensely and whose input I greatly value as a fellow podcaster. But I think what you guys are going to want to hear, and we're going to dive into, is the story of Collier Landry, a multifaceted artist known for his work as a cinematographer, podcast host, and award-winning documentary filmmaker. He has gained widespread recognition as a creator and subject in the documentary A Murder in Mansfield, in which he chronicles the murder of his mom by his father and his role as the star witness as an 11-year-old boy. So I hope you're going to enjoy this interview with Collier. It's a privilege to bring him on the show, and I just got to ask you to help out, right? Like, share, subscribe, and help us continue to deliver purposeful content and brighten days of people around the world. So enjoy this week's interview with Collier Landry. Collier, my friend, finally, I've gotten you on the On Purpose Podcast. Welcome to the show.
I'm so glad to be here, Jerrod. Thank you.
Thank you, man. I got to tell you, I'm sitting here looking at you on camera right now, and as I prepped for this, I was watching Little Collier, and man, I was just, what a crazy life story to get you here. And I want to say thank you for just being a good dude. For those of you guys that don't know, I met Collier through a Patreon support group, and he's helped me immensely just with ideas and support. And he's definitely my connection for any technical upgrades you may have noticed. Collier's responsible for all those. And I just wanted to say thanks, man, that you so many people are selfish in this world, and you got a lot of talents that you're sharing with people and helping people like me that maybe don't have those talents grow. So I just wanted, before we even started with your story, just tell you thanks for being you.
Thanks, man. That's really sweet to hear. Thank you. Not to sound magnanimous, but it's like I was with my girlfriend yesterday and I was asking her about a shower head, and I was like, did I give you my shower head? Or was that your shower? Because I can't find this like shower head that my parents had given me. And I was like, I should replace this, because we were in the shower together. And I was like, oh, it'd be great if I could hand her this thing, right? And she said, no, that was mine that I had. I was like, oh, okay, cool. And she's like, but I just want to tell you, like, on my 5th year anniversary with my ex-boyfriend, he was supposed to install that for me. And within 2 months of dating you, when you were first at my apartment, the first thing you did is you walked into my bathroom and you saw it in a box and you said, why isn't this installed? Then you proceeded to go in and install it like straight away.
So you're already like, winning over.
And I was like, well, but to me, I was just like, yeah, like it's no big deal. I just trying to make this like, normal people don't do that. Normal people don't share all this stuff that you were just like, pointing out the technical thing, but like, I don't understand why people don't do that. Like, that's so baffling to me. It's like you have this moment or this opportunity to impact someone's life in a positive way. Why don't you do that? It doesn't compute with me.
No, 100%. And that's one of the things we share with our community is if you can do anything today, just go be nice to somebody. Like, you don't have to have millions of dollars. You don't have to have everything in the world figured out. Just go smile and be nice.
I mean, look, having money, it's obviously something that eludes me as a creator, but I've been a creative entrepreneur for 2 decades now and more than that. And, money has always been something that has eluded me in a lot of facets, but, I know some very wealthy people who are not happy.
Yeah.
And I think that, before we actually started recording, we were talking about your life and the decisions you made in the last couple of years and how that's impacted your life so positively, right? And then thinking about like, there's this great, and I don't know whoever said this quote, but I've regurgitated in my own version, but something of like, the light of another candle does not extinguish your own. It ends up enhancing, I always say it ends up enhancing us so we can all illuminate the world,
Yep.
right? And it's interesting how so many people, and I think this has been a long time coming, but so many people approach life as a zero-sum game, and it's really not. And I feel bad for those people who do that, who I have to win, you have to lose, right? You
Well,
know,
well, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If I think it's a zero-win game and I have to win, you have to lose, when I get to the end of my life, I'm going to be by myself. I'm going to have zero friends, close relationships. So who really won?
yeah, and it's interesting you talk about, because as I get older, I think, and having gone through what I've gone through, I think about this a lot in a sort of self-reflection. Even um like you talk about at your end of your life, and if you have zero friends, I think, you know, I remember a friend of mine had said, well over a decade ago, it said, "Wait, you go to movies by yourself?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Like, I mean, I don't do it as much anymore. I just kind of got out of going to movies after the pandemic, or during the pandemic. I it, he said, and I said, "Well, yeah." I said, "I'm happy with my, like, I love it. I don't need somebody to be there to entertain me, but I think it's like, even if you approach life as like, I think about Forrest Gump on the bench, right, at the end of his life, and and reflecting back on all the things and the positive memories and all the ways that they interacted in their life with others and benefiting other people, that you're really not alone, even if you are alone, because you have so many of those amazing instances where you shared who you were and gave the best version of yourself, and that was reciprocated in kind, or maybe not even reciprocated in kind, but just appreciated. And I think when I go through what I've been through, and obviously we'll get into it, but when I think about like sharing my story, and when I made that decision to do that, I got this feedback from so many people saying, it's not the people that you see or that reach out to you that are you're impacting. It's the people you never hear from that are the real people that are impacted by the power of your story and the power of what you're doing, that you're giving hope to. Like, those people that just don't that can't reach out or don't reach out, that are so amazingly impacted. And that's really powerful. And that's something that I think my mother would be very happy to hear me say, and be in that space of going, yeah, this is a cool thing to do.
No, absolutely. I love it. All right, before we get too far into this, Collier, I don't know, man. I can't take you mountain biking on the highest peak in California without warming up your legs and stuff before we got to climb there, right? Like this on purpose heavy lifting requires a warm up. So our community gets to really know who you are before they hear how amazing your story is. So are you ready, Collier, for your warm up?
I'm ready for the warm up.
Here we go, man. First one. I'm not even slowing down. I'm firing them at you. Deserted island, rest of your life, one food. What are you going to eat?
Avocado.
Oh, man. Why do you pick avocado?
First one to come to mind.
Mm.
Avocado.
All right, what are you going to do with it?
Lots of nutrition, fats, healthy fats, good for your skin, fills you
That's
up.
true. So here's what I will slow down and warm up, and I'll tell you this. I usually have two sorts of people in my deserted island food group. The healthy ones that want to live on that island for a long time eating avocados, or the ones that go the opposite way and take tequila and pizza.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I guess I didn't think that you can make the pizza, but I think I would eat avocado over the pizza.
there you go. You'd be
And I don't
healthy.
drink it, and I don't drink anymore, so that's a thing too.
All right, avocado it is. All right, you get us one superpower. What would it be, and why would you want it?
I think personally, man, it's sort of like a double-edged sword, though. If I could have superpower, I would say time travel, but then I think that comes with a lot of danger, right? Because you're in effect, I think if you are able to travel back and forward in time, you're actually playing God, and that could
Oh,
be dangerous.
that's
Uh,
true.
it's even with the strongest of moral compasses, that can be dangerous. Um, I would say, if that's not a possibility, flying, or the ability to grant people wishes?
Oh, let's go.
Again,
Yeah.
a little God complex there, a little bit of like who's worthy, who's not. But if you figure that you could inject some hope in someone's life by granting them a wish, and you judge that that's that is worth the merit of what they've done or what they're trying to do with their lives, then yeah.
I love it. And I would trust you to have that, Collier. I would trust you with that power, my friend.
Thank you.
I know you do good with it. All right, favorite book?
Um, I would say ticking is the bomb by Nick Flynn. Book I read in 2000 and I believe 2008, 2009. He's a poet, an author. He wrote another book before that called Another Bullshit Night in Suck City about his struggles with addiction to heroin, alcohol, things like that. But he ended up in a sort of a sober, in that book, he ended up in a sort of sober living situation, halfway house type thing. But he ended up meeting his father, who he never knew, who was an alcoholic and addict, who was homeless, and ended up coming into the shelter where he was volunteering.
Oh, wow.
And so Another Bullshit Night in Suck City is about that. His follow up to that is The Ticking is the Bomb, which goes back and forth between what he went through as a child and his mother's relationships with other men, and him reconciling the fact that he's about ready to be a father himself, and also at the same time looking as a journalist at the Abu Ghraib situation and the torture that was involved with the American military in the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, and under the guise of a war on terror. So he's sort of navigating the waters between all of those things in a sort of in and out of jumping around in time, points of time. And I found it a very fascinating and really telling book. I think probably because I can understand what it's like to come from that kind of a background. I mean, my father
Sure.
wasn't a drunk, father's a murderer, but still like just that type of thing.
Yeah, wow, that'd be interesting. I'll have to put that on my list. All right, and I have a feeling this next question is going to lead you right into the story, but you get to have dinner with one person. Who would you have dinner with, and what would you want to ask them?
I mean, I guess the obvious choice would be my mother.
Right.
Have dinner with her again. Um, and I think I would want to, if I could ask her anything, I would want to know about how her experience as a young adult or a child led her to raise me the way that she did in her very brief time on this planet.
Yeah, powerful. When I was doing the warm up question, we keep the same warm up questions for every guest, and I got to that one. I was like, okay, I'm 99% sure exactly what Collier's going to say on this one. So let's just go from there. Talk to us about your relationship with your mom and kind of the story from there.
So I grew up, I grew up seemingly what I thought was a normal childhood, even though I know that aspects of it were not normal. But I think everybody's, your own experience is unique to yourself, right? It's all you kind of know of the world, right? And my mother was my constant companion in my life. And my father was a doctor, and I had grown up the first 5 years of my life in Virginia on a naval base outside Dahlgren, in Virginia. And and then my father, my family, we moved to Ohio, to this small town called Mansfield. And my relationship with my mother was, as I said, I was her constant companion. My mother was sort of the driving factor in my life and in my school and in my education. And even though my father was a very educated man, being a doctor, both my parents went to Penn, and education was held in very high regard in my household. At the same time, my father wasn't around a lot. And when my father was around, I grew up in the very sort of, fight, flight, or appease sort of situation, or fawn. Um, you don't say anything, they'll set daddy off. Don't do this and that, because my father was a rageaholic, and he could just be apoplectic at the drop of a hat, right? And he would, um, he was violent. He was a violent guy sometimes, and anything could set him off. So I grew up around this sort of, tiptoe around your father type thing. And my mother sort of encouraged that too, because he was violent with both of us, and very, angry, screaming a lot. There was physical violence, but a lot of it was verbal abuse and just rage, which is terrifying.
Right.
Which is terrifying. My father's 6'4" almost, 230 pounds, and it's a big guy. So my mother, unbeknownst to me, my mother had taken and made me her whole life, right? And I didn't really understand that dynamic, but I would say that when we moved to Mansfield when I was like 5.5 years old, I started having friends whose fathers were also doctors or professionals, and I started noticing kids around me that were, in single family, unit homes where they were raised by their mom and they would go to their dad on the weekends, and I started discovering what divorce was and that whole thing. And but I felt very grateful that at least, despite the challenges in my family, it was again my normal, but also that I had a mother and father that were together.
Yeah.
So as the years progressed, my father's aggression and anger and rageaholicness, and just overall bravado, if you will, became more and more aggressive and angry and bitter, and he was just not a nice person to be around. My mother, tolerated all of that because, again, we had our own life, and my education was very, I was the kid who would go to school, and then he would, summer break would hit. I'd get to play with my friends for a week, then I'd go back and take more classes, science, art, music, all these things, right? My mother was very involved in all of this because education, like I said, there was a very high standard of education in my family. I was a kid that would go with my parents on the weekend to the bookstore and sit in the bookstore back before Barnes and Noble was a thing. And we'd sit and have coffee, or my parents would have coffee and I'd have a soda or whatever, and be reading magazines and books. And that was like a Saturday afternoon for us. And I liked that type of stuff. I was into that type of stuff. And that never has escaped me since. But I started noticing it wasn't until 1989 that my father, my mother wanted to adopt a baby from a child from Taiwan, and I was supposed to go with her, and I ended up getting stuck in my house, and because I had really bad asthma as a kid, so my mother went to Taiwan for 2 weeks, and that's when I was left with my father for the first time ever. My father was extremely abusive and nasty, and just violent towards me the whole time. And then he would apologize, and then he would like go on these rage roller coasters, and then he would stop, and then he would, oh, I'm sorry, or oh, this. And my father would, call me nasty things, telling me my mother was raising, I don't know, can I curse
Say
on this
whatever
podcast?
you want. Yeah.
Yeah, he called me a little, my mother was turning me into a little faggot. I'm a little pussy, this, that, and the other, because I didn't want to watch violent movies. So I was the kid who would cover his eyes, like watching this, because that's kind of how I grew up.
Yeah.
Like my mom was like, don't watch this or don't do this. And so I paid attention to that. So my father took this time away from my mother to really abuse the hell out of me. And when she came back, obviously, we were, there's going to be this new little child that was going to come into the family. I was 11 years old at the time.
Okay.
And it wasn't for a few months that my father had introduced me to this woman. He took me on a Memorial Day barbecue thing to a patient's house in the middle of nowhere. And I grew up in this really small town in Ohio, right? So we're living in this small town, and my parents were very cosmopolitan. They grew up in Philadelphia, so they always longed for the big city. We would take trips back there in the summers to go back and see the museums, and we travel, and that was like our thing, right? But in this small town, we had rural areas and things that I wasn't really accustomed to, the Amish, things like that. So my father takes me to this Memorial Day barbecue, and I meet this woman. Her name is Sherry. And towards the end of the night, I'm walking around this lake with like one of her kids, and I look back and my father has his arm around her. And I asked my father, I said, what was going on? Why'd you have your arm around her? And he said, well, she was a patient of his and she was dying, and he was there to console her. And I was like, okay. So I never thought anything of it. Flash forward to Father's Day that year, a few weeks later. my father takes me to this suntan place and she happens to be there. And he's like, oh, look who's here. It's Sherry. And she gave us these radio controlled cars. And I had noticed she had a ring on her finger and it looked like my mother's ring. It was identical. It was my mother's ring, I knew. And I said, oh, that's interesting. My mommy has a ring like that. She kind of giggled and looked at my father. I'm playing with the radio controlled car and I look back and I see my father making out with her, which I'd never seen before, but I knew it was like, I'd never seen this. Let him do this with my mother. I'd never seen that, I was like, okay. When we got in the car, my father told me to lie to my mother and tell him that he had taken me to his office to give us the radio control cars as a present for getting good grades that year for school. So my father, I go back home. I tell the story to my mom, because that's where the radio control car. We go out to eat that night, and I get really sick. And the next morning, my mother's sitting on the porch, and I'm just so overwhelmed with guilt. And I come in and I say, Mommy, I have something to tell you. I think Daddy's having an affair. And I told her all about Sherry and how I met her, a few weeks before that, and then saw what I saw and brought up the ring and everything like that. And my mother said, well, I appreciate you. I'm sorry that you lie. I'm not happy you lied to me, but I understand you were obeying your father, yada, yada. She goes inside and she starts yelling on the phone. That proceeded to then my parents were now getting a divorce. And unbeknownst to me, my father was a chronic womanizer and had been for decades, even long before my parents were even married, when they were just in a relationship. And the sort of line in the sand, the Rubicon that you didn't cross with my mother was, my father's name was John, but she called him Jack. She said, Jack, you can do whatever the hell you want. Just don't involve our kid. And that moment that he involved me and introduced me to the girlfriend was the last straw for her. And she said, I'm filing for divorce.
Oh, wow. And you were 11 years old at this time.
11 years old. It was summer 1989. And that is when everything started. And it just progressively got worse and worse. And, my father would be telling me how he's starting this new family with his wonderful girlfriend and how wonderful her children are, because she had children from another marriage. They were maybe a couple years younger than me. And how amazing that family is. And I'm not a part of that. And he's going to make sure that I go to public school. My mom's working at McDonald's and we're living on the street. I'll never go to college. He's going to make sure that he destroys my life. He's telling me all these wonderful things. And I remember it was in November of 1989 that my mother was driving with my sister and myself, and we were going to eat at this place called Bob Evans, which is like a little Midwestern type of restaurant that people
sausage, right?
Sausage, gravy, and all this stuff. I used to like to eat oatmeal. I was like an oatmeal fan. So we went to Bob Evans, and I remember driving, and my mother was just really down. And just about, like I said, a week before Thanksgiving, and she said, Collier, I would never leave you. And I said, well, of course, Mommy, I know that. And she goes, I want you to know that if I ever leave you, your father probably had me killed. And I was like, no, Mommy, that's not going to happen, and this, that, and the other. But I filed it in the back of my head. Flash forward to, there's the holidays, there's these things. Again, my parents' relationship is not good. My father had always for years slept on the couch, but that was always under the guise of like that he had to work late at night, so he didn't want to disturb the family and this and that and the other. So, but as I had started to figure out, it was because he was always off seeing his girlfriends. And my father had multiple relationships with women. Like he didn't have just one girlfriend at a time. He would have several, including being married to my mother. So he was just sort of known in our community as being this type of guy. So that was, that was an issue for sure. And I basically, I said, it was Christmas with my sister and, our first Christmas together. And then every year my grandmother would come, who is my father's mother, who was very close to my mother, almost like her own daughter. And she didn't come for Christmas because she had pneumonia, but she did come for New Year's. And it was December 30th, 1989. She shows up with my father and we have our little I give my grandmother her Christmas gifts and we're talking, and I get ready for bed. I say good night to my grandmother and my sister. And I say, good night, Mommy. I give her a kiss on the cheek and I go to bed. On the morning of December 31st, 1989, at around 3:18 a.m., I wake up to what I'm pretty sure is a scream. And then I hear two loud thuds separated about 60 seconds apart. And in between those thuds, I hear my father's voice muttering very low. And I'm terrified, and I'm in my bed, and I always slept with my door open. And something was telling me, like, don't get up, don't get up. And I'm staring at my Batman clock, which was on the wall. And I start to hear these footsteps come down the hallway. And I'm counting them, the footsteps, and they stop at my doorway. And I'm pretending to be asleep, so I'm sleeping with my chin down, but I can see out of my peripheral vision the feet in my doorway. And I'm just like, don't look up.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty much convinced that if I had looked up, I wouldn't be sitting here today. Because at that time, it's no, it's nothing to say she left with the kid, make the hole a little bigger type thing.
Right.
So I wake up, I somehow go back to sleep. I wake up a few hours later. It's daylight. I run straight to my mother's bedroom, which was obviously down the hall. And I notice the bed is in complete disarray. My mother always made the bed in the morning. That was like her thing. I still do that to this day. I get up, I make my beds, just a habit, right?
Right.
And I'm looking through the bed spread for blood because I fear the worst has happened, what my mother had alerted me to a couple months prior. I come downstairs. My father is sitting on the couch. He has a towel wrapped around his waist. He had just taken a shower. I said, "Where is my mother?" And he doesn't answer me. I ask him again, "Where is my mother?" And he says, "Well, mommy took a little vacation, Collier." And then he starts into this whole story of, because I tell him that I heard these thuds in the middle of the night. I heard a scream, and he was telling me that my mother and him got into a fight, that the sound of the thud that I must have heard was her throwing her purse at him, and he dodged it and it hit the wall, and she threw her credit cards at him, and she stormed off out of the back door in the dead of winter, New Year's Eve, 1989, walked down our driveway, which is probably 50 yards long, and got into a car that was waiting at the end of the driveway and left. And I knew he was lying to me. I knew my father was a liar. I had come to realize that through the divorce and all these things, but I knew that he was a liar, and I didn't believe him. And then he starts launching into this whole diatribe about how we're not going to call the police, we're not going to call the FBI. And we said, we're not going to call the FBI. I just thought that was really strange. Like, what it escalate it, you know? And my father left because he was planning to move, and I bought this, or he was planning to move his practice and all these things. And he's got this new life that he's starting with this girlfriend. And so he's going to go off and be with the girlfriend, right? Which is what I assumed. So when my mother had told me that back in November, I had taken all of my mother's friends' numbers and written them on a piece of paper and stuck them inside a Santa Claus Garfield that I had in my room because it was the holidays. And my mother had just gotten a cordless phone, and my grandmother is there, and she's listening to everything my father said. And my father leaves, and she's like, "Okay, you're not going to call the police. We're not going to do anything. You're going to obey your father." So I grab the cordless phone. I lock myself upstairs in my mother's bathroom, and I start calling all her friends on the list, telling them what would happen, and said, "I can't call the police, but you guys need to call the police." So later on that day, shortly, a couple hours later, 2 uniformed officers show up at the house. It's New Year's Eve. And they start asking questions. My grandmother is like apoplectic at the fact that the cops are here yelling at me, saying, "You called the police." And I'm like, "I didn't call the police." And which is true. I didn't call the police.
You didn't call
them. And I said, the officers sort of, my grandmother's walking around with us, sort of helicoptering behind me, making sure, monitoring what I'm saying. And she says to me, or I pull one of the officers aside, and we're up in the bedroom where they're looking, which is where my mother was. And I said, "I don't trust my father as far as I could throw him," which is something my mother always said. "I don't trust your father as far as I could throw him." So nothing happens. That day, my father comes home, and it's New Year's Eve. And then he leaves again the next day, and a detective shows up at the house. And something that my mother had always told me growing up was, she would tell me about these stories of the carousel horses. And you grab the brass ring, and that's what they would do as a kid. And you grab the brass ring and win a prize. So my mom always told me, like, grab the brass ring in life, Collier. And so this guy shows up, David Messmore, and he's a detective, because he had become interested in this because it's New Year's Day on a sleepy small town in Ohio. And he's like, oh, let me just kind of check this out. Doctor's wife goes missing. This is interesting. Because they filed a missing persons report. Because I called my mother's friends again on the cordless phone, and they said, well, we filed a missing persons report. I'm like, okay, she's not missing. Like, he's done something to her, and she might even be dead. You know, I very much know what's going on. But when my father's home, I'm watching him like a hawk. I'm trying to figure things out, and this detective shows up. So, brass ring moment. My grandmother, again, is apoplectic. She goes, I'm going to call my son. He's got a doctor. He's going to sue you guys and yada, yada for harassment. So she goes into the other room and gets the phone to call my father. And I knew I had that one opportunity with Dave Messmore. And I said, my mother would never leave me. Something has happened to her. Give me your card. I'll call you when I go to school tomorrow. Gives me his card. He's kind of looking at me like, who's this kid? So my grandmother comes back. She's yelling at him. He's coming home. And she's like, okay, I'll come back later and I'll talk to the doctor. So he leaves. My father comes home later that night. He tries to come back. My father's there with his lawyer, his divorce lawyer, this whole thing, right? So the next morning, which is January 2nd, 1990, I go to school. I guess I should say right before that. So that night, his girlfriend also came over, who I never really interacted with outside of those few instances.
Sure.
And she brought a pork roast and it's New Year's dinner. And it was just disgusting that she was even in my house. Like, I'm like, why is this woman here? Because I hate her, because she's in my mind, the women that broke up the marriage and all this stuff, because I don't know all the backstory, right, at this point in time. So the next day I go to school, picked up by a friend. I go right to the principal's office, give him the card, say, call this guy, Dave Messmore at the Mansfield Police Department. He comes down and I begin to lay out over the course of 2-3 hours the entirety of my parents' relationship as I know it. The divorce, my father's proclivity for violence, the girlfriend, the story, the ring, the way that my father had raised us in Virginia, all this stuff, my relationship with my mother, explaining everything, the trip to Taiwan, all these things that my father did to me growing up. I gave him everything. I spilled the beans about everything because I want to find my mother. And I think he was pretty much looking at me like, this kid is really odd that he's just locked in on this, but there's something to this kid. There's something to this story that, like, this kid feels this passionately about this. So over the course of the next 3.5 weeks, myself and this detective, David Messmore, we have this relationship. But I tell him at that day, I say, I'm going to go home, and when my grandmother's downstairs dealing with my sister and making dinner, I'm going to pull out the bookshelves in the wall upstairs to go into the crawl space to try to find my mother's body. I'm going to look for all these clues. I'm going to see if she left with this purse, because she would never leave the house without this one purse, et cetera, et cetera. And I told him I would start observing and monitoring my father's behavior like a hawk. So every night my father would come home, I would notice things. And it started with, he had these nicks on his hands. My father always had perfectly manicured hands, nicks and scratches on his hands. Then he'd ask me one night to rub his shoulders with Bengay because he was very sore from, quote, moving boxes. His behavior started becoming more and more peculiar, where this is a guy who, I said, had this proclivity for violence and violent movies and behaving violently and machismo. We had machine guns in the house and stuff because he was a Vietnam War vet, because my father made up all these stories. My father was a narcissistic and very a malignant narcissist and a liar. And so he had all these backstories over the years of being a naval fighter pilot hero and all these things. He had bought medals from the Army surplus store and had all these photographs taken. So he said he was a lieutenant commander in the Navy. My father never went to Vietnam. My father got out of going to Vietnam, but he was in the Navy as a doctor, but he was a civilian doctor. You know what I mean? He wasn't an officer. And all these things that had happened, he would tell these stories, and he told them to the girlfriends, he told them to colleagues, and a lot of people knew that he was a liar, right? So he had this facade of being this, decorated naval war hero, and it's just not true, right? He had more medals than like the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was like absurd, right?
Sure.
My father had this story, and I always forget to tell people about this. Like he had this long history of deception way before all of this. But I didn't know any better, right? I'm a kid, right? I don't know this, it is oddly coincides with Tom Cruise and Top Gun and all this stuff. It's just weird, right? But so over this course of this like 3.5 weeks, my father, his behavior is becoming more and more peculiar. And every day I'm going to school and I'm meeting with Dave Messmore, talking to him on the phone, or he comes down, telling him about clues. And Dave Messmore, mind you, is coming to the house every night because my father's there meeting with his lawyer. And so he's coming to the house every night to sort of, see if he can, quote, talk to my dad about the disappearance of my mother, right?
Yeah.
But that's not, my father refuses to talk to the police. And he's becoming more and more prevaricative with his statements and things of that nature. So he takes me one night to this is like mid-January 1990, to his office. And on the way back, to pick up paperwork. And on the way back, we stop at a gas station. And my father goes into the gas station. I know that's my one opportunity. And I start rummaging through his truck as I'm watching through the windshield. And I open up his center console in his truck, and I find two photographs. One is of a house that I've never seen before. And the second one is of his girlfriend, Sherry Campbell, and her two children sitting in front of a fireplace wrapped in plastic. So to me, I said, this is a new fireplace, and this is part of this house that I've never seen before. I go to the next day to school. I tell Dave Messmore about this house. Then again, my father's behavior is becoming more and more odd. That year I got a Nintendo for Christmas. I was playing a violent video game. He saw me playing the video game and got upset because it was a violent video game. I'm like, who is this person? Like, you're Mr. Macho. You're upset that I'm playing Double Dragon? Like, what? This just weirdness, right? And it wasn't until around January the 20th that my father comes to me and he goes, Mommy, and he would always say every night we'd be talking about my mother and speculating on with his attorney where she could have gone and all this like rehearsed just bullshit, essentially. Like, I know he's responsible for her being missing, if not dead at this point. And he's saying, oh, she could have gone to Toronto, or maybe she's off shopping in Washington State, or she's in DC visiting your uncle, which is his brother, all this nonsense. And so he says to me, he goes, Collier, Mommy's just left us in such a state, and she decided to leave us. And it's always this story of she decided to leave us. It's her fault. It's this, that, and the other, right?
Right.
And he says, I think, I have a medical conference coming up in Florida. I think we should take a father and son bonding trip to get your mind off of Mommy leaving us, and we can have a bonding trip together. And I knew right then at that moment, well, two things. One is we always went to medical conventions in Florida, in Clearwater Beach, Florida, but they were always in the spring because they were centered around spring break, and families, and Busch Gardens is there. So it's convenient. So doctors will show up with their families, right? And they're not right after Christmas holiday. And I knew in that moment that I wasn't coming back from Florida. I told Dave Messmore that. And on the morning of January 24th, 1990, I woke up to two strangers in my bedroom saying, you've got 20 minutes to pack a bag, and we're getting out of here. And I can hear a bunch of commotion downstairs. And I packed the bag. I asked about taking my dog. They said, we'll come back for your dog. I never saw my dog again. And I come downstairs, and the entire house is flooded with detectives, men and women in white lab coats, contraptions, police cars in the driveway. They are serving a search warrant for my house in Mansfield, Ohio. And I go to my principal of the school's house that day. I don't go back to school. And I get visited by a caseworker. And I don't know what a caseworker is, but I know it's not good. And she basically tells me, police are looking for your father. And you're just going to kind of stay here for a minute, and we'll figure everything out. So that night I have the worst in this, situation. I have the worst asthma attack of my life. I go the next morning. I'm pretty sure I'm going to die. I somehow make it through the night because I don't have my medicine because I was at the house, right? Which is now a crime scene. And I go to the emergency room in the morning, and I remember the lobby was full. I remember being shuffled past the honor box where they had the newspapers and put in this room. And a friend of my family came in. He was a cardiologist. He gave me a breathing treatment. He gave me a steroid injection. I got stabilized. I could breathe. And then that's when they told me, Collier, Lieutenant Messmore found your mother, and she was dead. And it's really hard to articulate the feelings, the overwhelming emotions that kind of cascade down when you hear that, because on one hand, you are relieved to know that you're not crazy, that what you thought was in your heart was true actually was true. On the flip side, you are equally as devastated because what you thought was true and what you knew in your heart to be true was true.
Mm-hmm.
And that the person that caused this was your own father against your mother. So this is when it started to get really crazy. So my father is obviously arrested for my mother's murder. That's what I ended up seeing on the honor box when I left that room. I saw, Boyle arrested for wife's murder on the newspaper. And then I see, my aunt comes out, who's my mother's sister, who's my godmother. And to identify the body, I testify against my father at the grand jury to secure his indictment, because I basically was like the linchpin in the case at that time, and the character witness for both of my parents and for what happened in the time period of when my mother went missing to what happened when they found her. But ultimately, they found her buried underneath that house, underneath the basement floor that my father had purchased with his mistress, Sherry Campbell. And he had buried her in a grave underneath that basement floor of the house that I found the photographs of, and tied to Sherry and the whole thing. And what had then happened is my father's side of the family was very angry with me because they were blaming me for my father's arrest, because my father could do no wrong. He didn't do this, right? And how I was going to quickly rescind my testimony and all this and say that I made everything up, which was obviously not true. My mother's side of the family told me flat out they wanted nothing to do with me because I look like my father, verbatim.
Wow.
So I was remanded to the custody of the state and thrown into the foster care system. I had no family interested in helping me, being there for me, anything like that. So that's what I got to deal with. And for the next 6 months before my father's trial, it was real darkness. And, because the case was so popular, and granted, this is like, there's no internet or TikTok
Right.
or Twitter or anything at this time. I can't even imagine what it would be like now. But there was, a time where, even prosecutors said, you don't have to testify. And I'm like, it's over my dead body. But as the person who's like the main witness in this case, and as a child, I I was isolated from a lot of people. I wasn't allowed to watch television because it was all over the TV, read the newspaper, anything like that. So I lived in like this sort of despite what happened, in a state of despair, but also just not feeling very isolated and alone. Foster care, I don't care what kind of foster care situation you're in, it's terrible. My foster care situation was not good at all. And, and then having a family that's turned your back on you is not a fun thing. And you're 12 years old and you've done absolutely nothing to, to merit this treatment from anyone.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you something there, Collier. So you're 11 years old, 12 years old at the time it wraps up.
Yeah.
When your mom's body was found, and now you got to deal with the mixed emotions, right? Like, she's definitely not coming back, but at least now we know what happened to her. What was it like? Like, were you hoping for like people to accept you and go, "Oh, Collier's telling the truth. Like, we accept this," or what did you like? What were you thinking as a little guy was going to be the reaction there?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was telling the truth. So I
Right.
just assumed that everybody would know I was telling the truth. And I think that a lot of people did, but I think that also, you have a complexity with, and thank God for Dave Messmore, because if it had not been for him, I think my father would have gotten away with it, because he listened to the word of an 11-year-old child at that time that then started gathering all this evidence that he couldn't get. I mean, he didn't have access like I had. I had all this access. I was like, I'm going to solve this. I'm going to find out what happened to my mother.
Yeah.
I was beyond determined. So giving him the access. I don't think you would have that today. And his captain, his police captain, had threatened him and said, if are you out of your mind? You're going after a doctor. Like, they will sue us because they're concerned about the reputation of the department, and I guess rightfully so. But they were not amenable to them opening up an investigation against a doctor. And but he kept saying, this kid is absolutely determined. And then they started finding more and more evidence. I lead them to the house. Then they're just like, they talk to a realtor. The realtor talks about my father lowering the basement floor, the concrete, and digging it up to put a basketball court in it, and just weird things. And so my one of the things that I don't think a lot of people understand is that the murder was premeditated. My father had been planning this for months and months. Like, the tarp that my mother was wrapped in was on our back porch for 3-4 months before it was used as a burial shroud. The indoor outdoor carpeting that covered up her grave was on our back porch, for months on end. He rented a jackhammer to dig the hole before she was even killed. All of these things were premeditated. It wasn't like it was a crime of passion. I think a lot of people, either I don't articulate that well, even when they've seen my film, they've said the same thing. They found it hard, but it was premeditated murder. And for me, it was just my quest for telling the truth and getting justice for my mother. But it's like the worst possible thing.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I got chills just listening to you tell that story, and I know you, and I've researched this, right? So it's not the first time I've heard it, but just being able to look at you and share that with you, I can only imagine. Actually, I can't even imagine. Like, I can't even put thoughts to what the emotion would be. But I do want to ask you about that relationship with the detective and kind of where that went even after the case.
Yeah, so I testified against my father for 2 days at his trial. It was like a month long, and he was convicted of of aggravated murder, which is premeditated murder, and abuse of a corpse. And then I was put up for, I was in foster care. Then I was going to be adopted, and I had, after the trial, really developed a relationship with Dave Messmore and his wife, because they had a few older children. And I'd really bonded with them after the trial because I was able to be a kid, and they offered an experience of, like, I didn't, he was like sort of the hero in my world, right? And a good male role model, and someone who came in and, helped me solve my mother's murder. And there's this whole sort of, there was this bond that we had. And I asked them if they would adopt me, and they said yes. And I ended up not being awarded to them in custody. I was awarded custody to strangers. And, that was a real blow, because I was really hoping that would be something that would come to fruition, right? And I can even remember just like trying to negotiate with my adopted parents to, like, give me up for adoption to them and all that stuff, which is obviously, couldn't happen.
Right.
And ultimately, like, it all worked out, right? Everything works out how it should be.
Yeah.
But that was a real heartbreaking thing, because I thought, okay, well, there could be a happy ending to this story. And I remember the judge said to me in court, he goes, "You don't think I'm going to send you to live with the guy who put your dad in jail? Do you really think that?" He just said it really cold and callously, and I got very upset, and they made me leave the courtroom and all this. I was really angry and hurt. So that's all I wanted. I just wanted to move on. I wanted a little bit of something wonderful to happen,
Okay, and so now let's fast forward some 20 years later in your life, 30 years, maybe time frame wise, you decide you're going to share this whole story in a documentary, because now you got talents as a filmmaker. Like, okay, I'm going to share the story. What led you to that decision there to say, okay, I'm going to make this documentary, A Murder in Mansfield?
So I always grew up with the mindset of a couple of things. One is, I'm going to do something with this story because I'm going to make this into a positive in my life. That was the first thing. I'm not going to let this be my narrative. I'm not going to let this, it's interesting because I stayed in the community that all of this happened. So that's where I was raised. So that's what I was known for, as the kid whose dad murdered his mom, not because
Oh,
of high school jock. It was this, so that story would always lead me into a room. And I moved as far away as possible. I moved to Los Angeles, California, with the goal and the mindset of, I'm going to do something with this story. So I learned how to become a filmmaker, because I said that, and I didn't really know. You never really know what it's going to look like, right? You never know. We all have plans to do X, Y, and Z. But I said, I'm gonna do something with this story. I just don't know what it looks like. And I ended up meeting. I had seen a film called American History X that had changed my life, and I said, whoever made that film understands the consequences of violence. Flash forward 10 years later, I meet its producer, John Morrissey, and I told him, we became friends, and I was just getting into filmmaking, and he was looking for some ideas. And I said, I have an idea for, he was talking about doing something very silly. And I said, I have an idea for a docuseries. And the best thing is about the consequences of violence in America. And I think the best news is I own the rights to the pilot, and this is my story. And I gave him a book of newspaper clippings, and he had just done a feature film with a director named Barbara Koppel, who was a 2-time Academy Award-winning documentary filmmaker. And he goes, I think Barbara would be interested in this. But he read through all these newspaper articles and everything. He goes, oh my God, this is your life? Are you kidding me? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, I didn't know this. And I was like, well, nobody knows this. I don't really talk about it. I mean, a few friends sort of knew that my dad killed my mom. I grew up in Ohio. I was adopted. That was like the sort of story that everybody had. But nobody knew the real scope of what had happened. And so we ended up making A Murder in Mansfield with Barbara, and it was supposed to be just a 1-hour sort of special, and it ended up being a full-on documentary. And it came out at the end of 2018 and started hitting streaming services during the pandemic. I traveled all around the world with the film. We were in almost 60 film festivals, which is a great run.
right.
Uh, Won a few of them. It won a bunch of awards. I did a TED Talk. I was on Dr. Phil. And that became a sort of platform for me. And then in 2022, really started getting serious about doing a podcast. I started a podcast, which was called Moving Past Murder. Now it's called Moving Past Trauma. But I basically share my story of what happened to me, but also look at other true crime cases, also interview other true crime survivors. And I sort of scratch the surface of even interviewing people like the judge from my father's case, which I had never been able to interview, and sort of get answers and tapes that my father gave of interviews in prison and things. And, I'm doing episodes about the trial. I have a YouTube channel. I put it all on my YouTube channel as well. And it's my process of sort of moving past all of this and hoping to inspire others with my story. And that's what that all just kind of turned into.
And
And it's really
how did that help you? How did you feel going through the process of I mean, because I watched it and like you're clearly reliving it as you're sharing it. Like there's no doubt, like you're still there mentally. So
yeah.
how did that help you? I guess have mature today Collier process the emotions that 11-year-old Collier had to deal with initially.
Well, I think that the thing is that as an artist, when you have that calling, like that, the best art is born out of adversity. I mean, look at
Right.
the Holocaust, for example, and how many artists were created out of that, right? Or traumatic circumstances that drive people to create and to share stories based upon their own experience or living that out and having that level of creative catharsis. So for me, it was like, I made the film and the film is out there, and then I'm like, okay, what's next? Okay, let's figure. Okay, now I can start. Like life can start now. You know what I
Okay.
mean? And that was like a 28-year journey between when this all happened and when this film comes out. And then it's been continued through the podcast and figuring out what I'm going to do with my life next and what that looks like. And that's sort of the amazing and incredible thing, is that I was able to put that sort of button on it, that stamp, and go, okay, this is what I'm doing now. This is, I've shared this story with the world. I'm now dealing with this in a public space. I'm giving other people hope based upon my story, and now I can move on and do what I want to do. It's so weird because everything I had done leading up to that was to create that project. That's why I became a filmmaker. That's why I learned so much about film from all aspects of lighting and grip and editing. I mean, I'm an editor, so I edit my own show and my own content because I learned how to edit. I became a cinematographer. I got into the union. I did big films. I did commercials, music videos. I have music videos I've directed that have over 1 billion views on YouTube. I've done a lot of stuff, but it was all focused on being able to tell that story. That was it.
Wow.
And that was my drive. And I've been, like I said, I've been a creative entrepreneur my entire life. So, and it's one of those situations you look at it and you go, oh, you have a successful film. Well, it's a documentary. They don't make any money. I didn't make hardly anything from the film.
Yeah.
I didn't do it for that. I did it to heal myself. I wanted to share the story and impact one other person. And in fact, it's helped tens of thousands, if not, with the podcast, hundreds of thousands of people who've heard my story, who've seen my journey, who know what I've been through, and it gives them hope and optimism. And I think that's the biggest thing for me is being able, is putting that button on it. And also the flip side is that I wanted to know why my father murdered my mother. I wanted to understand that because I could never understand it.
Right.
And I wanted this answer. And that was my driving force too, is like, why did he do this? And as anyone sees in the film, because I confront him in prison, and I had a relationship with him for 26, 7, 8 years before that to get up into that point, to be able to go to that prison and have this conversation, So for me, it was this whole process of just being able to put that button on it, to go, okay, cool, I did that next. And that's what it felt like. Like now I can live my life and do what I want to do. It's really bizarre.
So it's become freeing for you.
100%. 100%.
Amazing. So what would you Collier now, looking back, if you could go to 11-year-old Collier, knowing the journey he's about to go on, but where it ends up for you, what would you tell him? What advice would you give him?
It's going to be okay. It sucks, but you're going to be all right.
Right. That's amazing, dude. Because as I was watching Dr. Phil and prepping for this, and I saw that little guy there, that's what I was thinking. Is like, man, if I could just step into the show real quick and be like, hey, little dude, stand strong, tell the truth, and your world's going to work out just fine.
And that's the thing, is like when I talk to like young people about my story, or the thing I try to share is that as you get older, you start to think about like the life that you've chose to live, or and the things that you've done, and you don't ever want to have regrets, because I think that's the worst thing. Mm-hmm. Don't ever want to regret like going for it or doing something or doing the right thing at the right time, because that will just eat you alive. And I knew that at that moment in time, the easy thing would have been to just check out or go with the story that my father told, or, just play it, quote, safe, if you will.
Yeah.
And I chose not to do that. And even though it has been immensely difficult to do that and so challenging, it has been worth all the pain and suffering. Because long after I'm taking the dirt nap, which will be hopefully a very long time from now, but I can know that I left a legacy that honored my mother, that honored myself, and that it was about doing the right thing in the right moment when you were called to do it. I don't know any people that had that opportunity, or that even seized that opportunity when it happened. And I'm really grateful for that. I mean, I wouldn't change anything in my life. I genuinely like the person who I am. I mean, I might not love everything I do, and I have my bad days and struggle. It's always a struggle to, the podcasting game. It's a struggle to make it sustainable for yourself, but at the same time, being able to share your experiences and your journey with an audience is an incredible power. And it's incredible when you get the feedback and the love and support of others around you. And even the haters too. I have plenty of haters.
Well, and
Plenty of people come after me.
and good for them, right? If they want to put their energy towards trying to bring somebody else down, all power to you. Go do it. But it's one of the things I try to share with my community and anybody that listens is every story has somebody that's waiting to hear it.
Yeah.
But we just got to share it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one of the things I love about you before I let you go, Collier, is not only have you done all this, but you're continuing to move forward and to give. And I love one of your newest adventures here, the Survivor Squad and the workshops you're putting together to start even more intimately sharing the process of working through trauma. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I started a podcast a few weeks ago with Tara Newell, who is from Dirty John fame. If you know that podcast, she's the one who took Dirty John Meehan's life in self-defense. And we started doing a podcast called Survivor Squad, which is where we interview true crime survivors and letting them tell their own story in their own way, in their own words, and sharing that experience and what that's been like. Because we both have been through this. And we are doing workshops, moving past trauma workshops, relationship building workshops, working through discovering boundaries in yourself as you've gone through trauma to help other people as well. We do those workshops. We're doing them coming up in June. I have my own podcast, Moving Past Trauma, which is also on YouTube. And you can find everything about those workshops, about what I'm doing with Tara, my podcast, Moving Past Trauma, my brand, Collier Landry, at collierlandry.com, which is my website, or go to collierlandry.com/links for all the stuff and all the places, my Patreon, ways to support the show, etc.
I love it. And for the On Purpose community, if you're like, okay, I need to get behind one more, I got space for one more dude in my world, one more guy or girl to lead me, consider putting Collier in that space, because I can tell you, man, I love the guy. I'm blessed. I get every 2 weeks we spend some time together, and it's an honor, Collier, to have you on the show and to be able to bring your story to our community.
It's an honor to be here, Jerrod. Thank you guys so much.
And remember, team, life is far too short to live any other way than on purpose. We will see you all again next week.